Good evening and welcome to yet another edition of Law and Order, brought to you exclusively by Channeleye. As you know, ladies and gentlemen, during each episode of Law and Order, it is our objective to educate you, our dear viewer, on matters that are of relevance to your day-to-day lives. But we look at it from the perspective of a lawyer, but not so much to get into the nitty-gritties of the legal aspects of the subject, but to help you basically come to grips with what the law is with regards to each of these topics. And tonight, we are going to delve deep into a topic which is of great importance to, I believe, every citizen in Sri Lanka, and that is the topic of conservation. What do we as Sri Lankans do to protect the beauty, the natural beauty that we have been blessed with here in Sri Lanka? And to deal with this area is someone who is highly respected in this field, and that is none other than Mr. Ravi Algama. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for taking time off your busy schedule to be with us here at Law and Order. How are you this evening?
I'm fine, thank you.
So, sir, would you be able to, well, before we get into that, I just returned from a trip to Alla. I travelled there by train and I was awestruck by the beauty that surrounds us as Sri Lankans. You know, sometimes we just take this beauty for granted. Sir, what do we do? What kind of laws do we have in Sri Lanka to ensure that this beauty is not robbed from us and that we as Sri Lankans treat the natural beauty that we have been blessed with some importance and we protect it ourselves?
Sri Lanka actually has a very rich history of environmental conservation, going back almost to the time of the advent of Buddhism to Sri Lanka, like 2,500 years ago. I think people are familiar with the story of King Devanampiya who was about to shoot a spotted deer with his bow and arrow and then when he was confronted by Arahat Mahinda and who explained to him the importance of the right to live of every creature, he not only gave up the hunting that he was about to embark on, but also decreed that within such a distance from that spot, within a radius of so many gauas, as they would say at that time, no animal can be hunted. Historically, that was the world's first wildlife sanctuary. Sri Lanka also can boast of the world's oldest historically documented tree, which is the Bo tree at Anuradhapura, the Sri Mahabodhiya. There are older trees in the world, I must say, like the redwoods in California, which by modern methods like carbon dating, they have been found to be over 4,000 years old. But there is no historic value in that because there is no document to say when they were actually planted. So when I say the oldest historically documented tree, that is what I meant at Anuradhapura. We, in this part of the world, we had veterinary hospitals, we had even cemeteries for pets, long before these concepts became known and of course better practiced in northern and western countries now. But these things are not something that anyone else needs to teach South Asians, particularly people like Sri Lankans, because this is actually in our blood and we have a rich heritage of environmental protection.
So I think it would be safe to say that the idea of protecting our environment is ingrained within the Sri Lankan psyche. But sir, would it be, in such circumstances, would it still not be necessary to have a body of law that regulates the protection of our environment? And if so, what, through the passage of time, what are the laws and the other institutions that have been established to ensure that our natural beauty is protected?
What you say is perfectly right. Though this psyche is ingrained in our people, still, as it is commonly said, there is enough for everyone's need, but there isn't for everyone's greed.
Yes.
And human greed, avaricious nature of people, they are wanting to make money at the expense of things which they have not nurtured, have taken a heavy toll on the natural resources of our country. And in that respect, a wide body of laws that deal with the conservation of nature and natural resources are necessary and are in fact in place in Sri Lanka.
I see. Sir, from the time of our colonial masters up to today, now you spoke quite correctly about how historically Sri Lankans are taught to protect their natural beauty, the environment. But with the colonial masters and thereafter, after we gained independence, what are the types of laws that have been introduced to the body of law in Sri Lanka to ensure that we as Sri Lankans are aware, first and foremost, aware of this treasure that we have been bestowed with? And what, because most of the time I find that we are unaware of what we have, the treasure that we are living in. And number two, how are we made, how are we bound to protect this? What are the bodies of law that are in existence right now, and how did they come into being?
You will actually be surprised at the number of laws that are there, maybe close to 100,
I see,
which deal with one aspect of the natural environment or the other. Even very unknown ordinances and laws, pearl fisheries, chank fisheries, and so many different unknown laws which sometimes may be relevant, sometimes not so relevant today. But there are so many laws that have some effect or the other on the protection of nature and natural resources. Today, the environment is protected, particularly if I deal with the loss of species, the environmental problem of the loss of species, preservation of wild species. It is done in two different ways. It is under a statute called the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, dating back to 1938, which gave legitimacy to the then game reserves, which were maintained basically for hunting by the sort of elite class of society consisting mostly of colonial people and very few locals as well. So under the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, the environment is protected in two principal ways. One is by setting aside large extents of land within the country, water bodies as well as land, which are basically left untouched within inverted commas. There are certain management regimes and there are some kinds of activity that are permitted, but largely for wild animals and trees to evolve at their own pace, as it were. Now, these areas are called protected areas. not only under the Fauna and Flora Protection Ordinance, also under the Forest Ordinance, which I will deal with presently. So that is, and there is a hierarchy of areas and a classification according to the hierarchy, or in terms of the degree of protection that these areas receive. I don't know in today's discussion whether we are able to go into the details of the attributes of the different kinds of protected areas, but maybe on another occasion we may be able to do that. But the second way in which animals and trees are protected is by proclaiming that certain species are protected by law. In other words, taking them, destroying them, or destroying the eggs or the young, or their nests, or their many destructive acts are prohibited with a fairly extensive regime of punishments that are there for infringement of those rules. So those are the two ways. One, as I said, is setting aside large extents of land, and secondly, declaring certain species as protected. Now, we have to understand that inside a protected area, all species are protected, irrespective of whether they are declared to be protected or not, simply by reason of the fact that they occur within a protected area. But animals, unlike humans, will not know exactly what boundaries of protected areas are, and some of them are great walkers like elephants, and they will naturally stray outside their bounds of protection. And that is why we need a body of law to say what species are protected and what are the punishments that are there in law for the infringement of those levels of protection.
So, if we find now, for example, very often people use their April holidays or their August holidays to pay a visit to the Yala Wildlife Sanctuary or to Vilpattu or Min area. I don't know, as you said, whether we would have time to cover that entire area tonight, but would you be able to educate our viewers on what type of protected area, is it indeed a protected area as you stated earlier, Yala, Vilpattu, Min area, what are these different places? Because we do know that there are places that our wildlife is allowed to roam free, and they are provided a degree of protection. But just so that we would be able to understand what these different, the hierarchy of protected areas is.
In the wildlife laws, the highest degree of protection is enjoyed by the category known as an SNR, or a strict nature reserve.
I see.
Now, that is something like a holy of holies,
Okay.
where human access is neither welcome nor encouraged. The only reason for which you can enter a strict natural reserve is for research approved by the Department of Wildlife Conservation, something necessary to establish a widely applicable precedent for wildlife conservation. It's not basically not your own research to earn for yourself a PhD or to do your own thing. Such permission will not be granted, but it is for nationally important research activities. Access will be allowed, and of course, secondly, for the enforcement officials of the relevant departments can go into these. So at the moment we have 3 strict nature reserves in Sri Lanka. The Ritigala, which is in the north central province. You suddenly in between Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa, you will see this range of mountains. It's basically one large mountain which is always covered in mist even in the dry zone, that is Ritigala, from where the medicinal supplies of the ancient Sri Lankan kings had apparently come, and that part of that Ritigala area is now a strict nature reserve. Secondly, Hakgala, the sort of three-cornered mountain you see when you venture out from Nuwara in the direction of Badulla. Almost at the base of that mountain is the famous botanical gardens at Hakgala. Hakgala is also a strict nature reserve and also a part of the block 2 of Yala, which is between the Manik Ganga and the Kumbukkang Oya. That is also a SNR.
So there are 3 strict nature reserves.
There are 3 strict nature reserves. Initially, Wasgamuwa was also a strict nature reserve, but in order to increase its protection, the level of protection was actually downgraded to a national park.
That somehow seems like a conflict of...
It is. But the rationale is just this, because there is no facility for human activity inside a strict nature reserve, and that is the very reason why there was a lot of lawlessness, a lot of illegal logging and illicit gem mining and few things like that happening inside this. But the moment it became a national park, which I will come to, which is the next level of protection, there would be roads opened, there would be safari vehicles and of course private vehicles also. There will be campsites being opened, there will even be bungalows for people who would like a better experience of waking up inside the jungle. So then usually it is our experience that illegal unlawful activities will cease, because people like that don't want to be in the public gaze when they are engaged in these activities. So ironically, the protection level was downgraded to in fact give it more protection. So that was Wasgamuwa. So now it is a national park. So that brings me to the second category, which are national parks. Now these are, as it has been said, like animated shop windows. If you think of yourself inside in a zoo and you see the animals inside their cages, in the national park, it is as if you are in the cage, because you are in a vehicle, a mobile cage maybe, and the animals are free to roam around. Some of them actually come and watch you, and there are a few like bold elephants who would actually come and take a peep at your vehicle and see who's inside. So the concept is that a national park is maintained for human beings, particularly for city people like us, who with jaded city nerves, that we can go and sort of recharge our batteries, as it were, in a beautiful habitat of nature where every prospect pleases and perhaps only man is vile. So the national parks are, unlike the strict nature reserves, people are entitled to enter on payment of an entrance fee and a fee for a vehicle if you are going in your private vehicle, and you are within certain limits and within certain bounds. For instance, you cannot make noise, you cannot carry musical instruments, you cannot you can't stray off the main roads, you can't go off-roading, and you can't light fires. Subject to these conditions, people have a right, and indeed the national parks are maintained for people to go and enjoy this spectacle in its natural habitat. So there are many examples of national parks. Yala and Vilpattu are perhaps Yala, officially it's called the Ruhuna National Park, though to everyone it is Yala. Yala is actually a spot within the Ruhuna National Park, just close to the Manikgaga. Then there's Vilpattu and Udavalave. Then there's Vasgamu, I've already said. Horton Plains was earlier the next category, which is a nature reserve, but it was upgraded to a national park, thinking that since a lot of people were going to the Horton Plains, the state wanted to earn an income out of it. And they could have, under the fauna and flora, even a nature reserve, you can charge an entrance fee. But then at that time, the people in charge of wildlife thought best thing is to declare it as a national park. So on paper now, today we don't have a nature reserve, though it's there in the statute book.
I see.
So most of the areas we are familiar with, Horton Plains, I said, Lunugam Vehera, Boondala, these are all national parks, and now we have some marine national parks. Hikkadua was the first one to be established, and very soon I think we will have one or two more marine parks as well. So nature reserve is what we don't have, and we next have the sanctuaries. The important thing is all the earlier categories of reserves, protected areas I mentioned are called national reserves, like strict nature reserves, national parks, nature reserves, jungle corridors. A jungle corridor is an area where, particularly for migrating animals, most likely to be elephants, where there are two protected areas in fairly close proximity, then there will be movement depending on the fodder situation, on the weather, on water, availability of water. So just there are these traditional migratory paths, especially of elephants. So a few of those have been declared as jungle corridors, so that those will be largely left intact for animals to cross over from one area to another without much harassment by people. Then, so now the thing what I wanted to say was, all national reserves can only be declared on state land.
Not on private
land. But the last category, sanctuaries, can be either on state land or on private land. For instance, if you have a private estate and there's a stream that runs through it, and there is a particular kind of freshwater fish or some organism that is found only in that stretch of the stream that goes through your estate. In that case, the government is well within its rights to declare your estate as a sanctuary for the protection. Your rights of using your estate are not hampered in any way, except that you cannot harm that species inside that stream. So the sanctuary, a lot of people use the word loosely, Yala sanctuary, Vilpattu sanctuary, but they are actually national parks. Sanctuary is the last degree of protection, which all traditional activities, even fishing, are allowed inside a sanctuary. Even though a place may be declared as a sanctuary, the traditional activities can still be conducted, but once it's declared a national reserve, like a national park, all rights hitherto in existence are extinguished immediately. I might add that Sri Lanka is fortunate to have over 12.5% of our total land area directly under the purview of wildlife conservation, which is a very high percentage for a developing country. Indeed, for any country, it's a very large percentage. And we have to be thankful to the wisdom of our ancestors and also the colonial powers who had the foresight to declare these areas. And we have this very large percentage of protected areas in this country. Of course, it is very difficult to withstand pressure, particularly from politicians, because some of these areas are actually on very arable and cultivable lands. So then the pressure is so much to release them and a lot of promises are given at election time.
Yes, that's
and the
true.
easiest thing to compromise on is a place which is inhabited by those who cannot speak on their own behalf.
Yes, unfortunately that is all we have time for. But let me just say, the time that we had with you has been extremely informative, and we are most grateful to you for taking time off your schedule to be with us today.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Law and Order. We will see you next time at the same time. Good night.